And we're back with part 2 of the Watershed Management lecture. So on this slide right here, our what is permeability slide, you see that there on the left there's this soil size. You can click on that and watch a little video to help you kind of with this idea of permeability. But the big idea with permeability is that permeability is the measure of the soil's ability to permit water to flow through its pores or voids, so the spaces in between the soil particles. And so when you have loose soil, you have high permeability. If you have dense soil, or you have soil that really sticks well to each other like clay does, you get low permeability. So with groundwater, we've talked before about this idea of the water table in the unsaturated zone and the saturated zone. In our saturated zone, that's where we have an aquifer. And so an aquifer is where the water will be stored in the ground, where our groundwater is stored. And our water table depth is going to change seasonally. So here's another look at the idea. So we can see the blue dotted line. That's the top of our groundwater in the soil. And so that is our water table. And that's the top of our saturated zone. Above that, that's the area, our A and B layers, where we've got tree roots and we've got microbes and we've got bacteria and we've got animals, and all those things are going to be using water. And you can see when you look at the right of this figure that even if the ground changes, the topography changes, the water level kind of stays the same. So that's why we'll see some water up above the surface, but some water not up above the surface, because it depends on our topography. And just to kind of give you an idea, so when we're talking about, intermittent streams, so in the water table, and this idea of the water table is that it can change, and it's not going to stay the same. It just depends on the amount of water in the soil and how fast water is getting in the soil, and also nowadays with what we use water for, how much water is getting pulled out of the soil. So you can see in this graphic, we have a zone of intermittent saturation. Sometimes it'll be higher, sometimes it won't be there. So sometimes it'll be dry in the summer, sometimes it'll be where you see water, and sometimes there won't be water. It just depends. Our winter water table, we've got water up there above the ground. You've got water sitting in your stream channel. The summer water table, down below that, it's below the ground. So we still have water in the ground, just won't be able to see it above the surface. So when we have water in the ground, that's stored in an aquifer. And an aquifer is just a body of saturated rock through which water can move. So our water movement in the aquifer is highly dependent on the permeability of the aquifer material. And we kind of talked about that before. So most of these areas are going to be our sea layer or weathered bedrock or parent material. And so it just depends on the size of the particles, our makeup of the particles, our texture. Is it going to be more sand, silt, loamy, clay? What's it made out of? Or what's the combination? And then in terms of once the water's worked its way down, permeated into the aquifer, the water is going to move slowly towards lower lying places. So water will leave the system, and that's our groundwater flow. It does leave the system, but we get enough of it to pull up in the ground. That's going to be our groundwater storage. Groundwater in the aquifer is going to be in between layers of poorly permeable rock, such as clay or shale. It can be confined. It can be under pressure, and it can be soaked into these rocks as well. But they're going to hold the water because they don't need to use it. Rocks don't need water the way soil actually needs water to survive, and how water is part of soil. This stuff, for the most part, is just going to hold the water until the water gets used. So here is the Edwards Aquifer down in Texas, and it's just a really great example. So they get precipitation up in their higher areas, and you've got in their hills, in the Texas Hill Country, the water will work its way down into the lower areas. And so you've got these higher up little watersheds that are going to combine into this bigger watershed. And you can see that you get groundwater this whole time. And then you've got the water tying in from the rivers to little lakes. And all of this combines from littler watersheds into a bigger watershed. And then you can see on the right-hand side of this picture that then people can put in wells and can tap into that groundwater. Now, one thing that's really important to remember is when you put in a well, you want to put in a well that's going to be much deeper than where the groundwater or where the water table is. Because if you put it right where the water table is, remember the water table changes. So if you put it up high where the water table is, you'll get water sometimes, and sometimes you won't get water. So if you want to have a constant supply of water, you're going to put it pretty deep into the groundwater. So another place in terms of our watersheds where surface water ends up is in lakes. So it's about 21% of the Earth's fresh water. But remember, that's 21% of just 2.5% of the water on the Earth. Right? 21% of just the fresh water. Okay? And it's a resting place for water that's going to flow out of a watershed towards the ocean. Remember, water in a lake is still flowing into the ground. It's just doing it at a very slow rate. And that water is in constant motion. It's not stagnant. There is a persistent current. It's just much less than what you would see in a river. As a forester, you might hear the term lacustrine, and that just means it refers to lakes. It's just another way of saying lake water. And your heat content in your lakes is going to be found in your upper layers. And so why is that important? Well, the sun, that means, with the sun hitting it and all that, you're going to get much more biological activity towards the top of your water than you are lower in the water. So in terms of, say you had to manage a fishery, or you had to manage people fishing on a lake, there's going to be many more species towards the surface of the water than there are way deep in your lake. And so it's just another little hint to think about in terms of managing lake water. So just for me, kind of interesting, Lake Baikal in southern Siberia, Russia, is the world's biggest lake. It's got more water in it than the Great Lakes combined. And so about of that 20% of water that we have in terms of lake freshwater, 20% of it is in this one lake. So a fifth of the lake water in the world is just in this one lake in Russia. As far as the United States goes, Lake Superior contains about 10% of the lake water in the world, and Lake Superior has more water in it than all of the other Great Lakes combined. And so in those two lakes, so in Lake Superior and Lake Baikal, you have a third of all the lake water in the whole world. So I just threw that in there because I find that to be pretty interesting. Another place that we'll see water in terms of a watershed is riparian zones and wetlands. So this map right here on the right is a map of the U.S., and the green areas are all areas that are predominantly wetland. And then you've got some places, for California, it's east of the Sierra Nevadas, and for Texas, it's the Panhandle area and the Dakotas, where you have so many really tiny wetlands that you can't map it out the way this other one says and say it's predominantly wetland, meaning that the majority of that area is wetland. But you've got so many little wetlands that it is a wetland area. It's just that they're very small. And so up north in the Dakota, that's what they call the pothole region, and that's the whole idea of Paul Bunyan and Minnesota being the land of 10,000 lakes and all that. That's part of this idea with all these tiny little wetlands there. And then down in Texas, that area that I actually went to school at Texas Tech in Lubbock, Texas, in that area, and they call those playas, where you have a lot of these just little depressions that form little lakes and little wetland areas. So one of the big things with wetlands is that we're losing them. They're areas where people end up settling or just being lost in terms of conversion from just a wetland to something else like a housing development or a city or that sort of thing. Not much wetlands have been lost in Alaska because you don't have a lot of development. But you look at a place like California, or you look at a place like Iowa and Missouri, where you've got a lot of your wetlands have disappeared. Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, really big loss of wetlands in these areas. So hopefully, if you're sitting there and you're saying to yourself, well, what does it matter? If we lose wetlands, what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is that wetlands provide many valuable ecosystem services and resources to wildlife as well as humans. So one of the big things with wetlands and the plants and animals within the wetlands is that they're going to filter sediments and pollutants before it gets to the water. Extremely important in terms of the idea of helping us keep clean water. It also provides habitat for a third of our nation's bird species and nurseries for economically important fish species. So if you look at the graphic on the right there in section B, you can see that it provides a wildlife habitat and corridor, so a place where they can move around for throughout their range. So you're going to see in these wetland areas a third of the nation's bird species and a bunch of the important fish species. And what it really comes down to is acre for acre, these places have as much biological diversity as rainforests. Well, but why does everybody say save the rainforest and doesn't say save the wetlands areas? Well, because for the most part, people don't really understand that if you have all these small areas, that they're just as important as the big rainforest. They see the big rainforest and they see the rainforest being cut down and they say, oh, we got to save it because, it's this big, huge area. But these areas are just as important. Acre for acre, they have just as much diversity and they have just as much importance for species and for us, but we just don't see it because they're small. So what makes a wetland? You got to have 3 things, 4 things, depending on how you ask some people. So the 3 things you have to have is you have to have hydrology, so it has to be wet. So it's got to be saturated for at least 15 days during the growing season. That's how they specifically determine it to be a wetland area. You have to have hydric soils, so you have to have organic soils like peats. They have to be poorly to somewhat poorly drained mineral soils, meaning that they're going to hold water really well, have a high clay content. And you have to have hydrophytic vegetation. So 50% or greater of the dominant species in the area must be facultative species or wetter, meaning that there are species that will be found in a wet area and can grow in an area that's wet. So you have to have vegetation. More than half of your vegetation has to be vegetation that grows in water. Your soils have to be soils that hold water, and you have to have water there. And if you have those 3 things, plus in some people's mind, if you have connection from the flowing water to the isolated, making it part of the watershed, then that's what makes a wetland. The other thing we wanted to talk about was riparian zones. So a riparian zone is going to be an ecotone. It's a transition zone between aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems. So an ecotone itself is just a transition between ecosystems. A riparian zone is specifically the ecotone between aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems. So with a riparian zone, what good is a riparian zone? Well, it helps provide a moisture gradient, so it helps making sure that some some of the areas keep some water while some water still works its way into the soil and into the stream. Helps stabilize the bank, helps reduce erosion into the stream and keep sediment out of the stream, protects the water quality, and riparian zones are highly diverse areas. And if you say to yourself, well, what's the difference between a wetland and a riparian zone? The wetland meets those 4 criteria that we just talked about. Riparian zones aren't going to meet those 4 criteria, but they're still going to be very similar in area and very similar in the effect that they provide. They just don't meet those 4 criteria. So, just kind of give you a little more picture to it. So, left kind of the same things up there on the left. One of the other things we haven't mentioned is the idea that it's highly diverse habitat. So, when you have these riparian zones, these stream buffer areas, you get protection from erosion, you get the pollutant filtration, you get reduced flood damage, you get wildlife habitat, you get shade to keep thermal pollution from happening to your rivers, having them get too hot and causing problems that way. And it can improve the aesthetic value because these areas have water in it, which means you're going to get highly diverse habitat, which means you're going to get a lot of plants, a lot of producers, a lot of consumers, lots of plants, lots of animals, and they're going to be just, pretty areas. And so, what do they look like? All sorts of different ways. Bunch of different ways that a riparian zone can look like. And the easiest riparian zone to think about, hopefully for us being at Bakersfield College, is to just think about the Kern River. Where's the only place in town that you see trees? And where's the only place in town that you see any trees and have green areas in town that isn't agriculture or just grassland? And that's going to be along the Kern River. And so we got a nice riparian corridor going right there along the Kern River. But that's not a wetland, because it doesn't have water in it. The river does, but the area outside of it doesn't have water in it for 15 days during the growing season. The soils may or may not match up, and the vegetation is not 50% or greater of stuff found in a wetland area. So it's a riparian zone, but it's not a wetland area. It is that transition from the land to an aquatic ecosystem, but not a wetland. So this graphic right here just to kind of give you the idea of even if we have animals, can we still have healthy riparian areas? Absolutely. But we might need to do something like block off our agricultural areas from our riparian areas, because riparian areas are important, and we need wildlife habitat as well. If you have domesticated animals, you can get it where you have damage from overgrazing or erosion from the animals trying to enter into the stream or to drink in the stream. You can have polluting just from the animals, from the waste products coming from the animals. And so it's just the idea of thinking about how do we make sure to do the things that we want to do, but also making sure that we still think about these areas and care about these areas and manage them in the correct way. Because we really do depend on healthy riparian areas. We need these areas. We need that biodiversity. We need the flow and erosion control. We need the filtration to keep our water clean. And we want this beautiful scenery. We like things like frogs and fish and having plants and having these nice areas. Think about what the Kern River area would look like without any of that vegetation. And it's really easy for us to think about that, because just look at the canal system, the aqueduct system we have going next to the Kern River, because that doesn't have any of that riparian corridor and vegetation. And think about which one of those would you rather see. Would you rather see the Kern River, or would you rather just look at the aqueduct? So for the last part of this, we'll talk about water quality. So we've got four really important effective indicators in knowing that we have good water quality. So the first one's going to be our water temperature. So it'll help determine the rate of biological activity. Some things need really, really cold water. Some things can handle a little bit warm water, but a lot of species really like it to be cold. So if we have a lot of trees removed, we could end up having increased summer temperatures, which is going to decrease our biological activity. And we also want to make sure we have tree cover to kind of regulate diurnal temperature change, because during the hot parts of the days, we'd like to have some shade on our water so that it doesn't get hot and we don't have problems with the water quality going down. Another thing you want to look at is your dissolved oxygen concentration, so the concentration of oxygen saturation found in water. So aerobic aquatic organisms like fish are going to need oxygen to breathe during while they're in the water. And so increased temperature or organic nutrient loading or organic production from excess nutrient loading can lead to an increased demand in oxygen from other plants or other species, causing problems for the species that are already there. How else do you look at water quality? So suspended sediment, so the amount of turbidity that we have in the water, your total amount of total physical amount of suspended solid. So is my water clear or is my water murky and full of stuff in it, full of sediment and soil that's going to make it harder for my species to live in here and for me to have healthy, clean water. And then the transparency, so how much light is going through the water, because remember, you still have plants and vegetation in the water as well as these animals that need they need light in order to grow. So if I don't have some of the plants growing in the water, then some of the species that live in there don't have any food source. And so it's water transparency is also going to be important. What other things could I measure in terms of water quality? I can measure the acidic base balance of the water by measuring its pH. I can measure the buffer capacity of the water to measure the alkalinity of it. I can look at the nutrients and the nutrient loading happening in the water, and I can look at the toxicants. So if there's heavy metals in the water. But our four important ones are going to be our temperature, our dissolved oxygen, our amount of sediments, and our transparency. So the one big problem we want to try and avoid is eutrophication. So the process of increasing nutrient concentrations and biological productivity in aquatic systems. So that this can occur naturally or by human activities. When it occurs naturally, it's slow, but when it occurs by human activities, it's accelerated or fast. So we really would like to avoid that. Now, the big thing is that the big problem with eutrophication, or the simplified version of it, is that your oxygen consumption in your water is going to exceed your oxygen production. So we said you got things living in the water, they need that dissolved oxygen. If your dissolved oxygen, if there's more of it being used than being produced, eventually everything's going to kind of just choke out and die because there's not going to be any oxygen in the water for these plants and animals. So how does something like eutrophication happen? So the first step is that you get this nutrient load up. So you get this excessive amount of organic material. Things like extra fertilizers, sediment buildup, those sorts of things start coming into the stream channel. This is a big problem in terms of farming, because you get a lot of that runoff from fertilizers heading into the stream water. So then what happens is your plants in the stream say, oh, great, look at all this fertilizer. And they get bigger and they start, there starts becoming more plants. And then what happens is during the summer months, it gets really hot, and then you'll end up with these algal blooms. And what the big thing with the algal blooms is that they're going to prevent sunlight, and they're going to prevent, they're going to affect our water transparency. And then the sunlight's not going to be able to get in the water, so things can't do photosynthesis. So all of a sudden stuff stops growing. And when stuff stops growing, oxygen stops getting produced. Because if we don't do photosynthesis, we don't get any oxygen. And so now we have this nutrient load up. We've got plants and more plants. Now we've got algae. All that stuff's using up using up the oxygen. And then also the way the algae works is as they die, then they've got, it's getting broken down by a bacteria, and that bacteria is using up even more of the oxygen. So now you got plants using the oxygen, the animals that were already there using the oxygen, the algal bloom using the oxygen, no sunlight getting in because it can't penetrate through the algal bloom. You got the decomposing bacteria using all the oxygen. Now there's no oxygen left, and you get the death of the ecosystem. And so if you click on the left there, there's a link to a place in Florida where this has become a really big problem. But we're also seeing the same problems here. Lake Isabella was closed last year, and if you click on the bottom right here, you can read up a little bit about that. But Lake Isabella was closed for the same eutrophication problems as well. And so the big thing with eutrophication is that it's the leading cause of water quality impairment and deterioration. The biggest symptoms of it is you get that hypoxia, that oxygen depletion, and you get these extensive algal blooms, which are going to reduce aquatic life, and they're going to actually be toxic to humans, and they're going to basically kill off everything that's living in the lake. So let's kind of tie this whole thing together. So why do we have to pay attention to water and understand water and know how to manage water? Well, the national forests are the single most important source of water in the United States. Where trees grow, that's where water exists. And so that water provides water to a lot of people. Provides water to 60 million people and people in 3,400 different communities. And so specifically here in our area, we've got the Kern River watershed. The headwaters start in Sequoia National Park, so that graphic we just showed, that's talking about us. We are among those 60 million people. You get snowmelt from Mount Whitney being the main source of water for water in the Kern watershed. It also gathers from several small lakes within the watershed, and it all flows south towards Buena Vista Lake and the Tulare Lake Basin. But now that water has ended up as part of the California Aqueduct. So if you look at the top left here, that's an outline of the Kern River watershed and where it is within California. If you look on the bottom left, you can see, so it's got a North Fork and a South Fork. They meet in the Lake Isabella area, and that's why we decided to turn that into a reservoir, because it's the meeting of the North Fork and the South Fork. And then that water, and then in turn heads towards the Buena Vista Lake bed. And then just there's, on the right, there's an actual outline of the full Kern River watershed. And you can see at the bottom left of that picture, you've got Bakersfield. And so that's our watershed, our local one. And so I'll kind of leave you with this graphic right here, which just is the idea of, what should a watershed look like, and how important is it to the communities, and how do we do it right, and how do we make this all work with all the other stuff that we got going on? Because the thing is, we all know as human beings that water is critically important to our survival. And if that's the case, then we really want to make sure that we have a healthy amount of water, we have it available. We know the distribution of water is a problem. So we want to make sure that we can harvest and harness this water and use it as much as we can and enjoy it, and make sure that it stays an easily reachable critical part of our ecosystem because of how important it is to us.